Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the video that I posted today being November 16. Today's Tuesday. It's coffee break day. The ladies had a lovely cherry pie and another big coffee cake. I always have to eat breakfast before coffee break. I will be doing the Friday question and answer this week, Friday at 10 a.m. California time. I was slated for jury duty, but in California, it's like one-day service, or at least in Sacramento, so I didn't even have to go in. During COVID, they try to have fewer jurors in the room, so I've completed my civil service for jury duty this time around. So that didn't terribly disrupt my schedule. So I've got other things planned for this week. But today I posted this shamanic frame disruption video, and it reminded me, in that video I mentioned The Rest is History, these two episodes that they had on paganism with Ronald Hutton, who was raised sort of as a neo-pagan and is an English historian who specializes in early modern Britain, British folklore, pre-Christian religion, and contemporary paganism. He's a professor at the University of Bristol, has written 14 books, and has appeared on British television and radio. He held a fellowship in Magdalen College, Oxford, and is a commissioner of English heritage. He was born in India, so it's a very, very interesting guy, colorful guy. Has books written, and he was the guest on The Rest is History, and did a fair amount of treatment of neo-paganism. Now, here in Sacramento, I'm fairly familiar with neo-paganism because Northern California is sort of famous for hippies, ex-hippies, and a bunch of the things that they like to do. And so the entire neo-paganism enterprise is a very curious one. I was going to start actually with episode 114, but maybe I'll actually start with 113.
That in Protestant England, that celebrating this stuff is kind of papist. Is that the kind of thing that essentially is underlying the Wicca Man? I mean, the Wicca Man is about a kind of a pagan tradition going on, but actually, I mean, the policeman who ends up being burnt, spoiler alert, he's a kind of very devout Protestant, isn't he? I mean, is there a sense in which it's Protestant anxieties about Catholic holdovers that then inform how, in ghost stories and horror stories and so on, paganism is seen?
A bit. Protestants simply have more problems with paganism than Catholics, or even more problems, because both pagans and Catholics are heavy on religious ritual, and Protestants are not. So to a lot of particularly evangelical extreme Protestants, ritual in itself is something suspect. But
Now ritual in itself, but also ritual as such, because Richard Rowland, this morning I was listening to Peugeot's conversation on the Holy Grail with Richard Rowland, just feeling very in the middle of a whole bunch of things here, because on one side I sort of have Vervaeke, and he's exploring via cognitive science, and then on the other side you've got universal history, and I'm sort of the Protestant in the middle. But as Richard Rowland, who used to be a Protestant and went over to Orthodoxy, as he notes, Protestants have plenty of ritual too. It's sort of ritual as such, which is also, exactly what makes the new atheists a little bit crazy.
Man motif actually comes from something more modern and still pretty deep lodged. It appears in the 1890s, which is when, for the first time, the English start to realize that a modern pagan revival might be taking place in their midst.
Now, what both of these podcasts emphasize pretty clearly is that modern paganism was basically completely cut off from ancient paganism, and this we'll have to get into carryovers and some things like that, and we'll get into the place where Ronald Hutton talks about how it gets cut off. But what you have then is that in many ways these the modern pagans are in a sense a new religion. And it's coming out of, and where does it come out of? Then we look at all sorts of psychological categories generally.
The kind of paganism among which I grew up, in fact. And so there is a reaction among both devout Christians and people who aren't Christians anymore, but just don't want any more religion around, especially revived religion. And so this motif creeps into literature of the outsider going to a respectable looking rural British community and finding out that the locals are still secretly pagans or have gone back to being pagans.
And you can find those kinds of movies in the 60s and 70s. I grew up watching all sorts of things like that. And it continues on today that, we thought, we saw the Baptist church at the corner, but when you scratch the surface, they're all ancient pagans. Ancient paganism has never really been snuffed out. It's been here all along.
It almost always ends in tears because paganism reveals itself to be a bloodthirsty, terrifying religion. And sometimes there's a happy ending. John Buchan, the author of the 39 Steps and all those great thrillers, is very big on this. He wrote about it 3 times. But always there's a strapping Christian hero who obviously went to a very good school who comes along and messes everything up with the pagans.
So, Ronald, can I ask a question? This very nicely takes us to that point at the late 19th, early 20th century when paganism is clearly, it's either being revived or it's being invented, depending on your sort of historical perspective. So before we talk about that, what is it about that moment? Is it to do with the anxieties of a urban industrial society? Is it to do with modernism, the First World War? What is it about that time that gives people this thirst for, horned gods and mother goddesses and this sort of stuff?
You're good, Dominic. You've managed to wrap most of it within a minute. It is about the anxieties.
You can come again.
It is about the anxieties of urbanizing, industrializing society, which produce this new sense of the countryside as something sacred, something alien, something endangered. For which Christianity doesn't really provide an adequate literature as ancient paganism does, with its sense of a sacred nature. But also it's the unraveling of mainstream British Christianity. We are turning into a post-Christian multi-faith society for the first time. We're getting large numbers of Jewish refugees settling among us. You have ideas coming in from the East for the first time. On a large scale, forms of Buddhism and Hinduism that Westerners are finding attractive. So there is this sense of a Christian consensus breaking down. And there's also a kind of middle class, upper class fear of the newly empowered swarming masses, of the huge new urban working class with its trade unions and its music halls, and the sense that it might just shake off the middle class.
The anxiety about trade unions, even when I was growing up in the Christian Reformed Church in the 60s and 70s, you would still hear the tensions about trade unions. You'd have some recent immigrants from the Netherlands with their Kuyperian vision who, we're going to have a Christian trade union, and others who just saw trade union as a populist upright. It's the rabble rising up and not allowing the true elites to fulfill their function in society. So you have these egalitarian hierarchy tensions all played out throughout this.
Rather like a horse shaking off flies in George Orwell's image. And also that of this vast colonial empire with these huge numbers of subject, ethnically different populations and this tiny precarious elite.
Now, of course, some of, this is a UK podcast, and so some of this is in the UK, and as we'll hear a little bit later, in the United States, the dynamics are different when it comes to some of this.
Of Europeans governing them. So there's an enormous whirlpool of anxieties there with paganism bobbing around in it.
And is paganism satisfying those anxieties, or is it generating them?
Well, it has a double bonus. If you're part of the worried mainstream, then it provides a good punch bag. You can take out your anxieties upon it by writing novels like those of John Buchan. On the other hand, if you've been brought up on cold baths and preachers, the idea of an ancient religion with revered, old, rather beautiful texts and a tremendous art that basically tells you it's okay to roll in the grass, get naked, enjoy sex, and have fun, which can be alluring.
Which Kenneth Grahame's wife didn't she? And Kenneth Grahame, on their kind of wedding morning, they rolled around in dew. And he famously wrote in Wind in the Willows, wrote a vision of Pan, who becomes, I guess, a kind of emblem of that movement.
Yeah, we're going a bit too far with the Grahams and their wedding day, to which I admit fault, because I built them up in a book of
I was...
No, he was too timid. He was pagan in his instincts, but didn't want to upset the family. It was she, his wife, who really rebelled, didn't want a church wedding, refused to wear a ring, refused to wear a white dress. And on their wedding day, it was she who went out and rolled in her wedding dress in the dew.
And for those of us who are old enough to remember the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, I mean, flowers in your hair. I mean, you just had, there's this, it was much more of a mood. It was more of a soundtrack of what was going on, that this was rebellion against the establishment.
And put a crown of flowers on her head to establish her identity as a pagan. And she turned up looking like a thundercloud in church in this wrinkled, sodden floral dress with this large bunch of wilting flowers on her head. And the marriage went downhill from there. But Pan in the Wind and the Willows is really, really important. For a start, he shouldn't be there. He's not part of the story. And he disrupts the tone, which has been ironic mostly hitherto, about the misadventures of Mr. Toad, a classic parable of nouveau riche bourgeois anxiety about what the working class stoats and weasels are going to do to you. And suddenly there is this explosive chapter out of nowhere with this epiphany of a pagan god, realized in the most intense religious terms. Graham can only get away with this because he's ostensibly writing about animals, to whom Pan can be a god as Jesus can be to us. But since the animals behave like middle-class Victorian humans, it's deeply ambivalent.
Can I ask about another book of the sort of late Victorian period, a book that I think you know an awful lot about? So I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's Aradia or Aradia, I don't know which, by Charles Godfrey Leland. Now, this is, you talked about the discovering of texts underlying paganism, and this is in some ways, I mean, its subtitle is The Gospel of the Witches. And this is a book I think you did. Am I right in thinking you spoke about this when you were 20 or so in a public debate, defending it, and then changed your views? So this is a book that pretends to, or claims to be, rather, pretends is a loaded word. It claims to be the account of a surviving witch tradition in Tuscany, and that this became a foundational text this did become a foundational text for modern paganism, didn't it?
Certainly did. It deserves to be. It's beautifully written. I was 19 and drunk on it, and I went up against Norman Cohn, who was a great scholar of that period. And he wiped the floor with me. He did so very courteously. But it was the first time that I had an inkling that I might actually be wrong about this book. And indeed, I probably was. The late 19th century is the great age of folklore collecting all over Europe, in which urban intellectuals are going into the countryside and collecting stories and customs from ordinary rural people in the belief that they are living fossils of ancient belief and ritual. And one of these is Charles Godfrey Leland, an American left-wing adventurer, a great radical and a believer in revolution, who goes to live in Italy for a long time. And he comes out with a lot of Italian folklore, which everybody reckons is genuine, and Aradia, which is supposed to be a gospel of a pagan witch cult. Now, the idea that a pagan witch cult had been there was something raised earlier in the 19th century. The idea that the people persecuted as witches in the notorious witch trials of late medieval, early modern Europe, were practitioners of a surviving pagan religion, had been suggested from the 1820s onwards as one solution to the problem of why there were witch trials, why rational Europeans should do something so dreadful and stupid as putting people to death for presumed satanic conspiracies. And what Leland did was produce what he thought was, or claimed was, the actual gospel of this pagan witch cult. Ever since then, no historian of 19th century Italy has come across any other evidence of such a cult. B, it's easy to see where the image in the book is coming from. It's coming from the portrait in the witch trials. The same cast of characters is there, the same motifs. And C, analysis of the manuscript shows that he did have a collector, a local, who came back with the stuff, but there's no proof she produced the manuscript. And it doesn't seem originally to itself have been composed by somebody who spoke Italian fluently or knew it. So the whole thing looks decidedly fishy. The good thing about it is, to go back to my original statement, it is beautifully written and quite inspiring for those who want a rebel, countercultural witch religion meeting out in the woods.
Right. And I remember in the 1970s, I think it was the Reader's Digest Guide to Folklore. It kind of had a image of a horned man on the front, and it had fabulous illustrations. And in that, there was the very exciting thesis that William Rufus, who is shot in the New Forest, that this had been part of a witch cult, and that he'd offered himself up as a living sacrifice.
That seems very implausible, Tom.
Well, we have the world expert on this. That's not true, is it? That didn't happen.
I'm not a world expert on this. I don't think anybody should be a world expert on anything. But the hypothesis you're stating was that of a very remarkable person from the early 20th century, a very good Egyptologist called Margaret Murray, who, to put it bluntly, when on holiday, wrote books about the history of witchcraft, which were highly imaginative, highly speculative, and very popular. And it was she who took the 19th century idea that the people who'd been prosecuted for witchcraft, allegedly, had been surviving pagans, and filled it out with quotations from original sources from the period. Experts now reject the hypothesis, but she helped give birth to many of the defining strands of modern paganism, because increasingly she came to like the theoretical religion that she'd helped define as a boisterous, fun-loving, nature-loving, radical, popular religion. And as such, it had a great appeal to countercultures in the mid-20th century, including that which I embraced as a teenager.
Do you think the fact that she was an Egyptologist also influenced it?
No, not terribly, except that she was used to dealing with ancient paganism.
Right.
What really influenced her view was that she was a lover of folklore. And indeed, she lived to be over 100. She was an amazing lady. She became president of the Folklore Society. And folklorists, remember, had been looking for surviving paganism in the countryside for around 100 years by her time. And she just pepped up this picture of the pagan countryside.
Can I ask about, you talked about Leland being left-wing and revolutionary. And when you talk about that counterculture, that sort of early to mid-20th century counterculture, it sounds very reminiscent of George Orwell's famously disparaging lines about the kind of people who he deplores that are attracted to socialism. So he says they're fruit juice drinkers and nudists and sex maniacs and pacifists, and we need to get rid of them if the left is to triumph in Britain. Is there a kind of left-wing dimension to the sort of neo-paganism of the early? Is it people who are kicking against the system, the capitalist world, the sort of corporate, increasingly sort of homogenous world of early 20th century Britain?
Now it's interesting here in California because many of the New Age type people are, pretty left wing, and part of the wrinkles that I see with, let's say, the whole vaccine drama that we have going on now is, on one hand, I have friends and family who are right-wing evangelicals, and they're not going to get a vaccine, and all of that. And so then regularly in the news, we hear about all of these studies that show that Trump voters and Republicans and evangelical Christians aren't getting vaccine. Well, here in Northern California, I have friends who are nowhere near the right and nowhere near Christian in that sense, who are evangelicals who are not getting vaccines either. And they're not getting vaccines because they're unnatural and they're not going to put anything like that in their bodies. And, we so quickly have these facile political associations, usually in order to sort of make hay against our imagined rivals, when in almost every case, the situation on the ground is far more complex.
No. A lot of the people who are interested in folklore collecting are either notably left-wing, looking for a socialist utopia using the songs and dances of the common people, or they're notably right-wing, and the right-wing theme is initially dominant in the appearance of modern paganism. It's a wish for an idealized countryside in which everything, including the trees, know their place, but in which there is a libertarian streak because the common people can still have their fun. Merry England, after all, is very much a conservative idea in the 19th, early 20th centuries, in which the Lord lives in his castle and everybody else dances round the maypole and has a good frisky time at midsummer and is happy. And you're free of all the angst of revolution and socialism.
Could you, if you were doing a sort of family tree, and I know this is a huge stretch, is it a sort of cousin of, or is it related distantly to kind of the kind of world of pre-Raphaelitism and William Morris and that sort of thing, do you think?
Yeah, it is related and not too distantly to all that. So paganism, the barometer of the interest in reviving paganism, swings back and forth between radical right and radical left from the 1800s, I'm speaking literally here, the beginning of the 19th century onwards. And the first people to start celebrating bringing back paganism are the Romantic poets.
Yeah, I mean, so Keats and everyone.
Yeah, Keats, Shelley,
yeah,
Wordsworth, especially Keats and Shelley, who were really, really big at it and actually worshipped pagan deities 100 years before Kenneth Grahame met Pan beside the Thames. You get Shelley hanging up a garland to Pan in the woods and building an altar to him.
And there's that wonderful sonnet by Wordsworth about wishing he could see Triton and belong to a creed outworn or whatever it is, that the world is too much with him. And I guess that must be a huge inspiration.
It is, but Wordsworth's, as you've just said in that stanza, distinctly iffy about paganism. Yes, it sounds great, but I can't quite go there. I've got to keep my boots and my frock coat on. Yes. But Keats just gushes love of paganism and also weariness with Christianity. And so does the arch rebel Shelley.
Yeah.
So it's, again, we find ourselves in a strange place here with Jonathan. Well, that meme that someone just put out. Here it is, great meme by Chuck Parker. How it started, Jordan Peterson, clean your room. How it's going. Obviously, Zeus exists, and and then some of the pushback against Jonathan on Twitter about Zeus, and you can just something like this sort of illuminates the landscape like lightning on a summer's night. And suddenly you see that all these simple dualities of right and left and they're over here and they're over here, suddenly you find that people are in fact all over the place in different positions. And the different positions aren't random. They make sense, but they make sense with respect to whole bunches of historic lines. You have people who want to embrace Thor or Odin or revive an ancient religion in order to push back against Christianity, and usually specifically some elements of Christianity that they don't like or they think are taking us in the wrong direction. Or, you can see this in, obviously the environmental movement, which is, in some ways pagan, but there's obviously very deep Christian elements to it. And so you see religion as as sort of forming all over the place and for different reasons.
Ronald, we have a question here, a great question from Barry Grogan, one of our listeners, friend of the show. He says, does paganism in its popular understanding as exemplified by bearded men at Stonehenge bear any actual resemblance to the pre-Christian beliefs of Britain?
Well, there are two different answers to that. First, is it invented in the 20th century? And the answer is yes and no, because there are streams of connection that come down directly from ancient to modern paganism. And they are created in the ancient world, they reflect the ancient world, and they connect straight to the modern, like the custom of ceremonial ritual magic, invoking spirits using elaborate equipment and conjurations, like its downgraded but more useful folk equivalent of popular magic, simple spells and remedies used by cunning folk and wise folk, like seasonal customs, because there really are calendar customs in Britain which do come down from the pagan ancient world, and they come down to the present. Customs, dances, rituals. And finally, and I think most important, the unending love affair of Christian Europeans with the pagan ancient world, particularly the art and literature of Greece and Rome, but also Irish medieval, Norse medieval mythology reflecting paganism. The crucial difference between this and modern paganism is that all these streams are carried on by people who seem to be, to some degree or another, Christian, whereas in modern times, all four have been recombined and pagan goddesses and gods put back in to create a viable and, in modern terms, completely authentic pagan religion. But also to look at this question of revival. Most great religious traditions have a point in their history at which they go back to their roots. So Protestant Christianity is based on jettisoning about 1,000 years of medieval Christian tradition between to go back to the ancient world and recreate it. And recreation movements have happened in Islam, in Hinduism, in Buddhism over the millennia. So it's not unusual to find religious people reaching back over a long gap in order to remake something in the present. And as for the people in robes at Stonehenge, we actually know so little about prehistoric British religion, especially that of the Druids, the priests of the Iron Age, that it's really almost anybody's guess which is right and which is wrong. In other words, the modern Druids may have as good a chance of being authentic in their recreation of what ancient Druids did as anybody else. So it's a lot more of a free market than one might at first think.
Yeah. Could I, you mentioned before the break that there was kind of radical left-wing and a radical right-wing enthusiasm for paganism. I suppose the most notorious right-wing enthusiast, certainly for the occult, and I don't know, maybe for paganism, would have been Himmler. What is the link between Nazism and
whether he was the original one, whether...
So you've described Wicca as the only fully formed religion which England can be said to have given the world.
That may no longer be true as new religions are being born all the time. And I'm perfectly happy to call it the first. I defend that remark against outraged adherents of almost every other religion in Britain by saying that until Wicca, Britain had produced extremely important variants of, denominations of existing religions, such as Christianity. But Wicca was the very, very first religion that seems wholly to have been born in England. And I stress England.
As I said, there's a couple, well, maybe it isn't a paradox, but it's a religion that claims to be very ancient, that looks back to the pre-Christian world for its wellsprings, and yet simultaneously is kind of emerges in 1950s suburban England. Is that a tension that kind of has run throughout the decades that have followed Gardner?
It's a simple yes to that. It's a very dynamic tension. And Gardner himself had it both ways, which is a large part of the reason for his success. On the one hand, he says that this religion is what's been around since the Stone Age and was persecuted heroically and horribly in the medieval, early modern period. On the other hand, once you're in
what's interesting about that is that in some ways you take this Christian, again, they're talking to Tom Holland here. You take this Christian emphasis of the least and the marginalized, God's preferential option for the poor. We can use liberation theological language. And now this is reapplied to a modern religion that is sort of passing as a faux ancient religion. And so you're basically leveraging Christian tools in order to give it legitimacy as those who are persecuted and marginalized for the truth. And it's an amazing, and this is where you get all of these very strange inconsistencies that, ancient people would not have thought these things, but here in the Christian period, we make this stuff up. And he goes on to tell some really fun stories.
Associated into it, you're perfectly entitled to make up new bits of it, or even scrap old bits of it according to your taste. So it's at once immemorial and ultra-modern, which is the perfect package for a dynamic new religion.
And by and large, I've seen you in print rejecting the idea that it's people who are fleeing from the modern world, because you pointed out that Wicca adherents are sometimes, computer engineers or scientists or something. Is there a particular, from the 1950s or 1940s onwards, is there a particular social type that's been drawn to it, do you think? Or is it completely sort of variegated?
I'd love to get away with saying it's completely variegated and keep everybody happy, but it's not. It attracts a particular type of personality and a particular politico-social group. The particular type of personality is somebody who's highly literate, self-confident, eager for novelty and personal growth and self-exploration.
Now, again, when I think here in Northern California of people I know who they might or may not be into Wiccan, but they're into religions that are very similar to it, where they take bits and pieces of ancient things and put them together. These are often well-educated, highly literate people who are very high in openness, and they sort of then take all of this and paste it on top of, again, a fundamentally Christian value system that embraces the poor and the marginalized and the suffering and the least. And so you take all of this old stuff and you paste it on a Christian moral value system, and poof, you have a new religion to stand against horrible, mean Christianity.
And doesn't feel trashed by life. That's a particular mindset. People with other mindsets are going to be attracted to other religions, but that's your classic pagan type. Adventurous, self-confident, out to make something of themselves. And as for its
and if you're very literate and are a fairly good writer, a friend and neighbor of mine, she did fairly well writing things for this community. And again, here in Northern California, it's a very well represented group. There was a wonderful section in the Dalthit. Of course, this runs right across Tara Isabella Burton's beat, and there was a wonderful question that was asked in this video that I've played bits of quite a bit.
So I think it behooves us to ask, who's witchcraft, which paganism? Diane Purkis, the Oxford scholar, had a fantastic article in the Athenaeum Review showing that contemporary witchcraft bears no resemblance, conceptually or in terms of practices, to either classical or medieval witchcraft. Medieval witchcraft, unsurprisingly, was Christian witchcraft. He talked about the body of Christ, he sprinkled a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It was enchanted with the enchantments of the day.
And even if you get into Harry Potter and Hogwarts, because there you're trying to, once you have a movie, you have to be even more careful about the language and the symbolism. Why is it that Latin is fundamental to all of the Hogwarts spells? It's always sort of a kitty Latin that they sort of sprinkle about for all of their magic, and it's just completely made up from contemporary tropes, and grab some medievalisms in there, and as Jordan Peterson recognized, and put that onto certain archetypal things, and boom, you've got something that's going to go.
Striking to me about contemporary paganism is that it's highly consumerist. The emphasis is on buying products, crystals, books, zines, etc., tarot cards, and then using these as a kind of spiritual tool. So I wondered if you could talk about the connection between, dare I say, late capitalism and this kind of model of paganism.
Is that me? All right. Sure.
I think that's for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the way in there are different what I would call paganisms, obviously, and I think that the theology, or the implicit theology of like brutal right-wing paganism, is quite different from the resistance witchcraft of paganism. But that said, I think the way in which capitalism intersects with that is in this idea that, I mean, your sense of self, who you are, is not simply the way in which you extend into space as a body, is in our digital age, one might say, and in our capitalist age, as much about what you buy, where you put your energy, when that energy, whether that energy exists in dollars, which are a sort of reflection of time spent in some sense, or whether it's via the time you actually physically spend in a workout class, or how you kind of project your digital avatar in the world. I mean, I think the ways in which our conceptions of ourselves and our bodies have expanded such that how we spend our money is a statement about who we are. Yes, I think on the one hand, it is quite easy, and I am certainly tempted to sort of roll my eyes and say, okay, like buying a crystal that doesn't do, what does that mean to buy a crystal without effort, or to only sort of exert the physical effort on a SoulCycle bike rather than through some sort of fasting? I think it would be remiss of me to overlook the fact that that how one spends one's time and one's money are so intertwined with one's identity that it would be odd to say, well, it means something if you practice in this way, but it doesn't mean something if you spend money on it. And I'm quite uncomfortable with that. That grosses me out. But at the same time, I think that it's impossible to dissociate a capitalist witchcraft from how our expenditure becomes how we. And this is the case too with like what is sort of often called like woke capitalism or values capitalism, where or it's sort of converse. Whether you're buying something at Chick-fil-A, or you're buying something at Hobby Lobby, or you're buying something from Pepsi, or you're buying something from the razor brand, and I don't know if it's Gillette or Gillette. It's like Jif or Gif. I still don't know. I think the fact that how we spend our money is culturally understood to be a valid marker of who we are is the bigger question there.
Now, this is from the next episode of The Rest is History.
Asking questions, but they're very good questions. So keep them coming, Stefan. Why did Christianity totally eradicate pre-Christian religion in Europe? Why aren't there any pagan remnant communities left in Europe after the Middle Ages? So I guess that's the big question. Why was, in yesterday's episode, you're basically saying that there are no kind of pagan continuities that run through the Middle Ages into modernity, part perhaps from the kind of, we'll come to the one tradition that might. But why is it so successful? What happens?
You can answer that question most easily by panning back to look at the world, because Christianity is not unique in world religion. It's one of a very unusual but extremely powerful subset of religions, which we call world religions. In other words, religions of salvation, religions with a general message for humanity, carried by people who think humanity will be improved everywhere by converting to their religion.
Now, what struck me about that phrase was another really interesting conversation that I've been on the fence in terms of been trying to figure out how to grapple with, is this one that John Vervaeke mentioned about the artful scaling of religion. And that's not a religion, where John engages Layman Pascal and Brennan Graham Dempsey about these challenges that Peugeot and I have made to Jonathan's project. And again, I saw it in the comment section today. And of course, at the beginning of the conversation that I had with Jonathan, that I posted today about shamanism, John begins by saying that for many people, he doesn't have a problem with them returning to the religion of their youth in terms of addressing the meaning crisis. But even the framing of game B, of all of this stuff is very much within a Christian framework. It's salvation for the whole world, and it's one effort that can save the world. And how do we go about that, and how do we get there? And I've got a number of thoughts. I haven't been able to distill them yet in terms of engaging in this conversation. I thought about doing a full-blown commentary, thought about engaging certain segments of it, but just in that sense, it's even the totalizing of the problems. Brett Weinstein in his anxiety about, and Daniel Smachtenberger. I mean, a lot of the stuff from Rebel Wisdom. This is about, well, how can we save the world? Okay, so it's a totalizing threat. Let's say it's the environmental threat, or it's the collapse of civilization. And I'm not saying that these aren't real threats, or nuclear war. I'm not saying that these aren't real threats, but it's the totalizing of the threat, and it's also the totalizing of the remedy. It's not about me saving my life. It's about, humanity must be preserved. Civilization must be saved. Our legacy must go on. It's the totalizing of this, as John Vervaeke brought in, of this hyper thing that we imagine, of this principality, of all that we care for, and in John's case, a religion that's not a religion, an ecology of practices, et cetera, et cetera. It's, in that sense, it's taking from not paganism as such, but this, as I said very clearly, this small class of world religions. It follows that. It takes in those assumptions.
Islam's another, but also branches of Buddhism, Confucianism. And these religions are very effective steamrollers. Everywhere where they go, where they reach rooted, indigenous, immemorial religion, they tend to wipe it out. And they wipe it out in two ways. One is by converting the local leaders, by offering them an enhanced role and also a place in the afterlife. And so that way you behead the traditional religions, which were carried on by the local political and social leaders. And that's exactly what happens in Europe. You go for the kings or the emperors, and the rest follow. But also...
And for some of the, I was listening to this great courses on the Norse, and the Christianization of the Norse is a very interesting story. And I mean, part of the problem of paganism is that it just loses, and it loses. It doesn't, again, people like to sort of take a leverage a Christian moral system against Christianity itself and say, oh, well, paganism only lost because of the power of Christianity to subdue it. Now, if you were an actual pagan, you'd say, yeah, so then you become a Christian, because you're not going to back a weaker religion, but instead you sort of invert it and say, well, therefore, paganism must be right because it's the weaker religion that was being dominated by Christianity. Therefore, there's a moral sense of paganism that must be preserved. Completely in that moment forgetting that they're basically using a Christian answer that was used to, in fact, subvert bloody paganisms.
There's a psychological thing, that there's simply nothing inherent in indigenous religion to stand up to a religion of missionary work and conversion. there's no tradition of answering these things because you've never had to. And so they tend to go over because they have nothing inherent in them that tells them they can resist, that habituates them. Which is why later, when indigenous religions are revived, which happens all over the world, it's not just a British or a European thing, they tend to be a lot tougher and take on some of the attitudes and the techniques of world religions. And that's
right. So yesterday you were talking about this gospel, the gospel of witchcraft, and you talked about conversion. So there are kind of echoes there of what Christian missionaries were doing.
Yes, that's right. Paganism never has scriptures because pagans are not religions of the book. They're religions of ritual and contact with the natural world.
And this is part of the reason why, at the end of the other episode, just definitely, this is my favorite podcast. I try not to miss any episodes of The Rest is History. I enjoy listening to the banter of Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, and they almost always have extremely good guests on. They're very much I think a terrific podcast. But later he goes on to talk about, part of the reason we know almost nothing of many of these religions before either the coming of Christian missionaries in certain parts of the world who would write it down. A lot of what we know about Norse mythology, and again, comes through Christians who are, in fact, sort of preserving it. And this is where I find Jonathan Bijot and Richard Rowland's work very interesting, because a little bit later on, a few more episodes up, they have a couple episodes on Alexander the Great. In a storyverse way, a lot of these ancient pagans are in a very interesting way redeemed by Christ. And you look at Jonathan Bijot and talking about Zeus exists. There's some of that dynamic in there as well. And so, where was I going with this?
So the term gospel or scripture applied to paganism is an imposition on it from an alien language.
Yeah.
It's interesting that at the present day, although sometimes particular writers market their books, mostly to Americans, with titles like The Bible of the Witches or whatever, the sacred writings of modern pagans are books of ritual.
And that's the point I was getting before. In terms of the upper and lower registers, again, we just don't know the mind of these ancient peoples. There are artifacts. This is what they mentioned towards the end of the first episode with Ronald Hutton. There's acts of, here are the rituals. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do this and do this and do this and do this. But it's all this mind, which either there's no writing. And again, if you've got archaeology, archaeologists try to, mind read based on real scanty things. It's hard to know what they thought. And this is part of the reason that we tend to, if you go back to the Jurassic Park movie where they talk about, well, they didn't quite have all the DNA from the dinosaurs, and so they had to fill it in with like frog DNA or something, and it was that frog DNA that allowed them to because they only bred one sex of the dinosaur so that they couldn't fertilize, and so in Jurassic Park that's how they managed to stymie the scientists who tried to keep life subdued. And so what happens is that this ancient stuff gets appropriated, usually in order to fight intranecine Christian or Islamic, just the battles within the world religions to make up for the tensions.
There's no theology there at all.
Right. There
are no laws telling humans how they behave in relation to the divine, as opposed to each other. So it remains
and that's a key thing. There's no laws. And so when you look at, a portion of C.S. Lewis that I come back to again and again at the beginning of The Problem of Pain, Lewis rightly notes that it's in Judaism that the moral intuitions and the numinous intuitions get combined. Well, in paganism, the numinous isn't combined. Here are the rituals in order to, keep the evil spirits out or manipulate the spirits or use the spirits for your own behalf. in Judaism, the moral and the numinous get put together.
Different concept of
Yeah,
religion.
but that is a continuity, though, isn't it? That is a. I mean, is that a deliberate attempt to preserve the spirit of original paganism?
It may just be a natural thing to do, because if you're going to be pagan, you have to model yourself on ancient paganism to some extent. And there are just certain things that are bred into it, like not having gospels or scriptures, but also having feminism, environmentalism, and personal choice.
Yeah. Could I, just before we go to a break, there are two kind of traditions that people have argued did survive from pre-Christian times, pre-Islamic times.
I'm going to jump over this.
Of early Christian churches, hangings.
So a possibility there. Sorry, Dominic, I was interrupting you.
I was about to say, before we go to a break, though, that surely raises a much bigger question, which is how much does in the sort of our folk imagination, if you like, in the popular imagination, there is now a sort of among people who've never not read up on all this, there is this sort of vague sense, Christianity must have incorporated lots of elements of pre-Christian religions, and they survive, and there are lots of pagan bits of the Christian calendar and all this sort of stuff. I mean, Halloween. People often think this about Halloween, don't they? Is that true? Did medieval Christianity have lots of pagan? Had it taken over and incorporated? When people often ask about the Yule log and all these kinds of things, is there any truth in that?
Yes, and yes. I should have covered this earlier, but I knew I was going on a bit anyway. One of the ways in which world religions succeed is not just they stamp out the old faiths, or the old traditions, but they absorb huge quantities of things from them, which is why, say, Tibetan Buddhism is riddled with deities and images from the pre-Buddhist religions. And in Christianity, even the very form of churches is taken over from pagan forms, the basilican shape of early Christian churches, hangings, incense, altars, carvings, sculptures, statues, icons in general. All this is a direct takeover from the old religions. And we haven't even started upon the folk customs. And in many ways...
And of course, a lot of this gets... Protestants tend to be much more worried about some of this, but of course Protestants bring in plenty of things too. And if you read In the Shadow of the Sword, I mean, Tom Holland basically makes an argument that Islam itself is sort of a pastiche of Judaism and Christianity that had developed in a certain region. Certain things get intensified, and that it goes from there. And so, part of what happens in religious negotiation is trying to figure out what stays and what goes. And, the kinds of people are like, well, religious people can't be on the same page. Well, that's because people can't be on the same page. And actually, communities, hopefully peacefully, negotiating changes in technology, changes in a whole range of things, you suss these things out. So the Christmas tree is good or bad, celebrating Christmas. So if you go to Jehovah's Witnesses or other little Christian sects, you'll have, no, we can't celebrate birthdays or Christmas or any of these pagan holidays. And for a long time, there was tension in some places between Halloween and it's Reformation Day. It's not Halloween. And I mean, these things go round and round and round and round, but these are ways in which the, religious communities are sort of trying to figure out what's in and what's out. And that kind of negotiation is going on constantly. And of course, there's hierarchies in there, and they have to mesh with the value system. And, and again, part of the work of Peugeot is is then trying to bring a symbolic element of this, and part of what you hear with Peugeot is, well, we're going to use sort of this language of symbolism to sort of suss out and evaluate and decide this is closer to the essence. You get into the center set versus bounded set distinction. Does this bring us closer to God or further away from God? What are things indifferent? That's Calvinist language, adiaphora. Just back and forth, and this stuff doesn't go away.
Developed Christianity just substitutes a Christian version for old religion. Instead of having many goddesses and gods, you have many saints.
And so when I was in the Dominican Republic, you had voodoo, and in order to be a good devotee of voodoo, you had to, of course, have some relationship to the Catholic Church, and there's plenty written about how, people brought over from Africa, they took their spirits and they put them on top of Roman Catholic saints, and then of course once many of these people become evangelicals, they put away that and they only pray to Christ. And I mean, this stuff is a living way of putting the world together, and it's been going on for a very long time.
Both sexes, who patronize, look after the very things that pagan carvings, sculptures, statues, icons in general. All this is a direct takeover from the older religions. And we haven't even started upon the folk customs. And in many ways, developed Christianity just substitutes a Christian version for old religion. Instead of having many goddesses and gods, you have many saints of both sexes who patronize, look after the very things that pagan goddesses and gods did. In ancient paganism, seasonal festivals are the great religious occasions. The same is true of medieval Christianity. In ancient paganism, sacrifice, the offering up of foodstuffs to the deities, is the central religious rite. In Christianity, it's offering up the sacrifice of the Mass. The foodstuffs concerned are the body and blood of the Saviour. And it goes on and on and on like that. This is how world religions succeed.
Ronald, we've talked about so maybe the kind of traditions that pass from paganism through Christian Europe. On the topic of other kind of slightly more highbrow ideas, kind of philosophical ideas coming from late antique paganism, could we go to the Middle East and one intriguing city, which...
Okay, and then they go on. And so again, listen to the whole podcast. It's not my intent to smuggle the rest is history onto YouTube. I would love it if Dominic and Tom, I know that they often record on Zoom. I'd love it if Dominic and Tom took the rest is history to YouTube, but that's, they have a producer and they have, commercials and all of that, and say, oh yeah, you've got commercials on YouTube too. Well, I know they're on YouTube, but you can, if you watch them on Odyssey or if you listen to it on the audio only podcast, you get to skip the commercials. Maybe I'll just incorporate some of these things sort of to wrap up this video, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to, I still haven't decided quite how to engage in the scaling question, because it's a big topic. And about 4 minutes in, John Vervaeke, basically talks about it, I think quite powerfully and quite importantly, why is it that the God that's taught in Sunday school classes and the God of Aquinas, they don't seem like the same God? That's a very fair challenge to give to a churchman like myself, to a preacher, and to say that these kinds of anxieties are not lost on preachers is of course no small thing. I caught Esther O'Reilly has now, come forward with her real name, the name given by her parents. She's Bethel McGrew, who is the daughter of a couple of very well educated parents who have positions in Western Michigan. Her mother does a fair amount in biblical studies, and her father does a fair amount in philosophy. And you can find them on the Unbelievable channel, where you can find Esther O'Reilly and Bethel McGrew. John's whole project is betterment, and betterment is sort of a dead reckoning way of trying to get at a better world. But as I mentioned before, we're all post-Christian now, and this is sort of, Tom Holland's argument that Christianity has so redefined the landscape, that so terraformed the mind space of the world, that the entire conceptualization of saving the world has to be downstream from the major Christian religions. And of course, within Christian traditions, this is no small thing. I laughed out loud when I saw this tweet by Bethel. "You bloody idiots, you just wrote David French's next Sunday essay for him with this church that's chanting, the church wasn't chanting, what was it? Let's go, Brandon. Is that the anti-Biden thing? Or, no, it's led by the church. So, churches are, as I said, I don't remember which conversation, in some ways you can think of humanity as this giant three-dimensional, machine that is sort of working out problems, and that's thinking it very much in terms of a telos. But you can't really talk about saving the world from the meaning crisis or from any other crisis without, in fact, framing the entire thing as a telos, that humanity must be preserved. I mean, Brett Weinstein's Game B. I mean, this is all deeply Christian in terms of its orientation. You might say it's deeply expressing from other world religions. Yes, but this idea of a linear progress towards a destination, that can even mean a linear pursuit of avoiding a tremendously problematic outcome, let's say, such as eternity in hell. I mean, again, Christianity is all over the place here. The thought I wanted to get in here was, as I was thinking about John Vervaeke's video, there's sort of two ways to recode the world, top, bottom. That's really the way these world religions do it. So here's the destination, the eschaton as such in Christianity. Well, how do we get there? And here's Christ. He is, he also, John Vervaeke just had a couple of enormous interviews with Garrett Vandenberg, who I spoke to a while ago. And really, I have to listen all the way through those. There's just so much stuff to listen to. I know I'm contributing to the problem, but hopefully I'll give you a little Reader's Digest in a sense, because we can't listen to everything. So you get a little filter from me of, don't miss this episode of The Rest is History, because it's really interesting. Anyway, I distract myself. Top down, which is sort of a religious movement. So here's Christ, here's the eschaton, here's the goal. We want to make it to the goal. But then there's sort of the bottom to I don't know where, which is usually how technology disrupts and changes the world, and that's sort of betterment in a dead reckoning way. So, it's the automobile is better than the horse, but you can't know all of the ends that the automobile entails. So taking antibiotics is better than, dying of an ear infection. But you don't know that, you can't think forward to enough to, well, antibiotics are going to create superbugs and. So I got to lower this mic. I'm sort of pegging it. I'm just always loud. That's, I grew up and my mother's like, turn it down. You gave birth to this person with the big voice, so can't be only my fault. And so there's kind of the religion is sort of top down, and it's telotic in that we're pursuing a telos, but bottom up is sort of like technology. And surely antibiotics are better than no antibiotics until we create these super bugs, and that in fact our bodies are more susceptible to. Studying bat viruses is important so that we can know, but if the bat virus gets out of the lab, on and on and on. So the pursuit of a proximal goal and all sorts of other things then seem to change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And, a bunch of the industrialization episode on The Rest of History was a great example of this. We've had all these, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, just thing after thing after thing changing the world. And then religions have to, adapt. And the religions have to figure out, is this a good adaptation or a bad adaptation? And, in fact, if you look at the history of religions which tend to be quite totalizing, they're about your whole life. Well, it's running the experiments on a rather massive level. So technological innovation forces rivals to adapt or adopt in order to not lose against their rivals or neighbors. And these tend to terraform. And so you kind of have top-down like religion. I gotta get my hands straight. Top-down like religion and bottom-up like technology. And this seems to be pretty much where we're at. And then you get chain reactions on every level. There's no question that the Colombian, well, what is it called in 1493, the Colombian Exchange. It wasn't until I'd read Reformations that I thought of the fact that, oh my goodness, Martin Luther was, look at when he was born as compared to, the Columbian Exchange that radically changed the world. And this article that I read a week or so ago, the sexual revolution killed feminism, because now suddenly anybody, I can be a woman right now. I can just declare it. And I can declare that my secret sacred self is feminine, or at least fluid. And so I'm not going to be like Grim Grizz and break out into a song, I feel pretty, but I could. There's a part of me that just sees Natalie Wood just twirling and twirling and twirling away on West Side Story about how pretty I feel. I can't say these things and not know that Grizz and those clowns are gonna have fun with it. Truth is, I love it. Ask anybody who knows me well, they'll say, yeah, he loves it. He loves it. I love to have fun. That's sort of my Jersey culture. And so then we deal with this betterment, and we'll reliably exchange meaning for personal survival and betterment. And these tend to be top down, these visions. This is where I get into much deeper questions about changing the world, because when you get down to, let's say, a local church pastor, all of this betterment and world changing, this is very much where the rubber hits the road. All of the complexities in life. Well, what is better? What is worse? And in fact, what religions offer are huge systems that really connect heaven and earth. And there's a lot of connection that has to be done between heaven and earth to have it make sense. So, just a few ideas from that. So I wanted to add that to the conversation that I had with John and with Julian and Capello. It was a good conversation, and I think these are the kinds of conversations we're having because, truth be told, whether it's Douthit, Tara Isabella Burton, Stephen Smith, or conversations about the Holy Grail, talk about doubling down. Symbolism and narrative are just so powerful, and they just scale so well that I'm really doubtful they're going away anywhere, especially in terms of the scale problem. So, and that goes to, I was watching Nate Heil talk to Albert Berg. Yeah, Nate Heil and Albert Berg going back and forth about what to think about Weston and his fallen earth creationism, which is, well, modernists. When modernists appropriate the Bible, they will do it in a modernist way. All of us need to fashion a worldview together that works. And it's not to say that God is indifferent to our need for a worldview, which is why, as a Christian and a Protestant, you believe, well, that's why he gave his son, and that's why he gives us the Bible. But at the same time, in all of these cultures, we have to figure things out and actually not construct a worldview that goes from top to bottom to put the whole thing together, and that will undoubtedly include stuff around the margins that well, maybe we can't really quite fit into the worldview from top to bottom. Just look at how ghosts don't fit in much of Protestantism. Well, you have the excluded middle in Protestantism that that Protestant missionaries have been, wrestling with, because you had God way up so high, and then you had people down below, and then you had many cultures in the world that had a very, very much a living middle in which saints got mapped onto and all sorts of things. And so these kinds of issues have been issues for a very long time. They just have sort of been pushed to the back in North America. But now with the recession of modernity, expect them to come forward, and expect Jonathan, we started with clean up your room, and we're ending with, I believe in Zeus, or Zeus was real. So here we are. So, okay, that's probably enough for now. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.